Hello, everyone, and welcome. We'll go ahead and get started here. So welcome to the Northeast Washington Forest Coalition's Pub Talk series. We had one last week. We talked about forest restoration. And then the topic for today is managing for wildfire resilience with Dick Dutton and Gloria Flora. And then next week, we're going to be talking about recreation on public lands with Bobby Whitaker, Tiana Luke, and Tim Coleman. And I am Gina Clays. I'm the outreach coordinator and facilitator for the group. So the Northeast Washington Forest Coalition is it's a collection of different stakeholders that help to work with the Forest Service to help manage the Colville National Forest up here in Northeast Washington. And so our goal with having these pub talks is to reach out to the public and help them. We want to increase the public's interest and awareness of issues affecting the Colville National Forest. So I think I'm ready for the next slide here. Gloria, I don't know if you can hear me, but if we could advance to the next slide. Thank you. So
which slide do you want? I just went through 4 slides. So.
Okay, yeah, this one is fine. The managing for wildfire. So yeah, wildfire is a topic that's on a lot of our minds these days. It's something we talk about a lot when we're discussing projects that involves coordinating, and it involves coordinating between many groups to come up with a good strategy. And just to talk about the, do you have a slide with, to introduce you and Dick?
I have it up on my screen. I'm not sure. Does it have Dick and myself and our logos?
Yeah, okay, got the right one now. So Gloria Flora is a board member of the Northeast Washington Forest Coalition. She is also the executive director of Sustainable Obtainable Solutions, which is a nonprofit to ensure sustainability of public lands. And she's the founder and former director of the U.S. Biochar Initiative and is a former U.S. Forest Service supervisor. And Dick Dutton is the treasurer of Northeast Washington Forest Coalition and is the monitoring coordinator and wildfire expert. And he retired from the Washington DNR and Army National Guard, and he's active on the Wildfire Incident Command Team. So welcome to our speakers, and we can go ahead and get started with the presentation. Oh, also, if you wanna, I was going to say, if you want to put in the chat where you're calling from, that's always appreciated too.
That'd be great. And with such a small group, I'm not too concerned about interruptions if somebody has a burning question, no pun intended, and would like me to answer it immediately. But if you do have questions, you can put them in the chat or just make a note, and we'll have some time for Q&As at the end. And I apologize, I'm a little surprised Dick wasn't able to join us immediately. I hope that everything's okay with him. And Gina, I'm a little concerned in that when I was flipping through the slides, you weren't seeing them when I was putting them up. So right now, do you see a map of the Colville National Forest? All right, great. Well, bear with me on the timing of the slides, and also the reason that I am not on video is I have very poor bandwidth, and so if I tried to be on video and show the slides, it probably wouldn't work. So I apologize for that. But welcome, as Gina said. And NUFIC is the Northeast Washington Forest Coalition, and we are a collaborative group that's been around for almost 20 years. And we operate primarily on the Colville National Forest, and that's the map you see in front of you, the lands in green. And the new addition to the Colville National Forest is this whole area in darker green, which is the Tonasket District, that was part of the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest, but to balance workload and because of the matching geographies and ecology, it was determined that it might be a better fit to have the Tonasket District administered by the Colville National Forest. So We also want to give a shout out to the Colville Indian Reservation and the Colville tribes, and the Kalispel tribe, as well as the Spokane tribe. We're on the land that they formerly occupied. There's some images of their homelands, and we always like to acknowledge that we are on shared landscapes here. A little bit of the natural history of the Colville National Forest. It's now 1.5 million acres. It was glaciated about 10,000 years ago, and it has abundant megafauna, that's large animals, and peaks up to 7,000 feet, and the ecology is a temperate rainforest to dry ponderosa pine. And the Kalispel legend tells of a scout who mistook a valley for a huge lake because it was so covered in camas blossoms. So, the collaborative. We formed in May of 2002, and we're comprised of timber industry, environmental organizations, and representatives on a 12-member board. And we, and this was developed, was started because to that point, there was basically a timber war, and the forest could not get hardly any product to market because the conservation organizations didn't like what they were doing and how they were doing, and so resisted. And so basically it came to a standstill, and so timber industry reached out to environmental groups and sat down and said, hey, can we agree on something? So and the Forest Service was all in and happy to support and participate, and we came up with what we call the Thirds Agreement, which is basically dividing what was then the 1 million-acre forest into three: the active management zone, restoration zone, and wilderness, or some kind of protected lands. And that we thought that represented a very balanced approach, and move forward with collaboration, and based on the principle that basically there are two things that interest us: the relationship of people to their land and the relationship of people to each other. So our strategic vision was to facilitate abundance and opportunities for everyone in the Colville National Forest, and to demonstrate through a science-based and socially influenced approach to ecosystem management that this could be done, streamline our collaborative process to minimize complexity and effort during the planning process. As you well know, planning for just about anything on the forest is fairly protracted and challenging. So we wanted to help improve the planning process as well, and create a balanced approach to ecosystem management, which was that one-third, one-third, one-third approach. So we've been wildly successful, collaborated on over 40 projects. The forest harvested 122 million board feet in 2020. That's the most since 1989, and an increase of about 20 million board feet from 2001. So actually, that's also one of the largest production numbers in the entire United States Forest Service. And on a tiny little forest like the Colville, that's really impressive. And we were doing it without doing the rather exotic and challenging large clear cuts, old growth removal, that kind of thing. And we secured a lot of agreements on appropriate restoration treatments and prescriptions. So we were very successful on the active management and the restoration side, but we have basically gotten nowhere on the conservation side. So we'd like to improve that and change that and get back to that protection of wildlands, which are a very important component of the Colville National Forest. We were looking at the potential for 220,000 acres of wilderness wildlands. That's not capital W wilderness, but it includes inventoried roadless areas, non-inventoried roadless areas, and backcountry. Right now, only 3% of the Colville is in wilderness, and just 43,000 acres, and that's the least on any national forest in the Pacific Northwest. And as I mentioned, these wildlands have irreplaceable ecosystems, wildlife habitat. They're the headwaters of the waters that we depend upon. And this is a map showing those wildlands in pink, and the green is congressionally designated wilderness. That's up here in the Selmo Priest. And so we are working and reaching out to the public to talk about a Northeast Washington prosperity and affirmations legislation concept. And part of it is because we want to support everyone's values so everybody can prosper, and that's in forest health and community wildfire. And you can see the list on the screen: conservation, recreation, indigenous culture, and acknowledgement. And how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to do it by contributing to a thriving local economy, which we know how to do. We've been doing that for 20 years now. Enhance outdoor recreation opportunities, which we've really started to step up to the plate on that. Thanks to a lot of help from outside groups who are interested in expanding those outdoor recreation opportunities across the entire spectrum. We want to honor cultural heritage and protect those irreplaceable wildlands and public lands. So just a shot of the northern Rocky Mountains and some of what we are trying to protect. Now, to get to the building resilience to wildfire. So this is a rather intriguing subject, and a lot of us have been working with this for many, many decades. So what we want to understand and work with in this building resilience is current forest conditions, projected forest conditions, which we often call future range of variability, natural risks, and climate. We also refer back to what's called HRV, or the historic range of variability, to look at history to see how forests behaved and covered the landscape in the past. But because conditions have changed so dramatically, we can't always rely on that as the guide. So we have to combine all of these. And we want to emphasize ecosystem diversity and resilience to reduce risks from ecosystem disturbances like wildfire. Insects and disease are part of that. Drought is part of that. We want to value complexity and diversity and use a spectrum of sustainable management options, working in concert with nature as well as in concert with the Forest Service and with public, and recognize the social preferences. So why are we so concerned? Well, wildfire risk just seems to continue to increase. We have bigger and hotter wildfires, but you'll notice in this first slide that the number of wildfires, it has gone up somewhat over history, but the issue is when you look back here in the early 90s, the difference between the number of fires and the acre burned was quite significant. You had a lot of white space there. And now as we get into the 2000s, we're seeing less and less white space, which means the fires are bigger and hotter and more difficult to contain. The top 5 years in terms of acres burned since 1960 all have happened since 2006. So that's another indicator that we have a current and increasing problem. We're on a trajectory that's not so good. Likewise, the cost to fight wildfires is rising, and then some other facts that substantiate our concerns. The average annual temperatures in the West have increased almost 2 degrees since 1970. That influences so many things, including the amount of lightning. Lightning increases by 12% for every degree in heat that you add. Our winter snowpack is melting up to a month earlier than previous decades. The fire season has increased over 105 days, and that's a figure from 2016, so it could be a lot more since 1970. And so basically forests are drier and for longer periods. So let's take a look at our climate context here, because climate is a big factor in this. So what is climate change? Well, basically it's just carbon that's out of balance between the active and the inactive cycle. For many years, for millennia, for hundreds of thousands of years actually, carbon in the active cycle would be found in the biosphere, that is the soil and trees. It would be in the oceans with aquatic biomass, and it was just cycling through between the atmosphere and land and water. But when we got into the inactive cycle, that is the carbon that was locked in the soil, in the Earth's crust, and brought it up to the surface for various important uses, I'm not criticizing necessarily, but plastics, fuels, etc., we added a whole lot more carbon to the atmosphere, faster than the atmosphere was able to absorb, ameliorate, rebalance. So what we're talking about is we're just in a state of pretty high imbalance in the carbon between the active and inactive cycles. This graph shows it pretty well. It starts back 800,000 years ago, and we can see that we have never been above 300 parts per million until 1950. And in 1950, we just kind of went through the roof. We're now at 418.7 parts per million and continuing to climb, which is very problematic. So this graph shows quite nicely, or quite scarily, depending on your perspective, what global warming really looks like. And we're looking at starting at 1850, and each one of these stripes is a year. And it's showing how we are above or below the average temperature. Globally, it's on a really clear trajectory. U.S. is a little bit more mixed, but our 6 hottest years on record have all occurred since 2006, same number we saw in the wildfires. So our temperature patterns in northeastern Washington, again, earlier on here from 1895 to about the 80s, we saw, distributions above and below this line, and on a cyclical basis. But once we hit about 1985, we were pretty much staying above the line, above the average. And now when we look at these last 10 years here, we are definitely way above average. So we lucked out, however, on precipitation because we're not quite so challenged, although this year, of course, is a very dry year. But we're a little better than others in the United States as far as the balance in precipitation in relationship to the normal or the average. But that aside, all that we need to know is that we are connected to and we rely on our landscapes. We see changes in trends that match projections and models that have been around for a few decades. Forests don't really care why the climate is changing, but we must prepare and respond. So, current forest conditions, what are we really looking at? Well, we are quite departed from the historical range of variability. We see a lot of fragmentation both in the terrestrial and the aquatic habitats. Our ecological and physical processes seem to have been altered in time, space, and frequency. Recall some of the statistics about wildfires. The time, space, frequency have all changed. And likewise, frequency, size, and intensity of disturbances like wildfire and insects and disease has been altered. So, and why do we have the current conditions? Well, there's changes in the extent, severity, and occurrence of fire and other natural disturbances. We have a 100-year history of wildfire suppression and exclusion because we thought that was a good idea. We weren't recognizing that wildfire is a very important part of maintaining forests. And so by trying to exclude wildfire, we created conditions which I'll get into shortly, which are really kind of eyebrow-raising. There's also a lot of widespread clear-cutting and high-grade logging, so we took a lot of the best genetics off the landscape and are left with lesser quality trees in many areas. We took out old growth. There's only 3% of old growth left in the United States of what was originally here when white men showed up. And so the sad thing is, besides for many other reasons, old growth is the most resilient age class structure in the face of wildfire. Old growth just didn't burn. I mean, when I first got into the Forest Service in the 70s, all the old timers would say, "Well, just let her hit the old growth and it'll settle down." And speaking of fire, we just don't see that anymore because we don't have a lot of old growth. Climate change is another big factor, and they've all contributed to habitat changes. So that's what we're really very concerned about, because how do you manage if you're not sure what the habitat is or is going to be? So let's look at some of the influencing factors. Certainly drought, and this is a rather frightening map that I pulled off the internet. It was released just last Thursday, showing the drought conditions. This darkest color is exceptional drought. White would be none. We're up here in the orange, which is a severe drought. And obviously you can see the consequences to agriculture and to forests. So what causes drought? Well, it's pretty straightforward. It has to do with the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere. But if you have a lack of precipitation, a low snowpack, and low humidity, which are conditions that we see more frequently all the time, then that contributes to drought. Likewise, wind currents, a change in the normal wind pattern and intensity. And I don't know about you, but I have just been surprised as can be by the amount of wind that we have here now and the drying effects that it has on vegetation. Deforestation also contributes, as well as soils that get damaged, either hardening, and that can be through compaction, it can be through severe fire, which creates hydrophobic soils, and it can also be through erosion. So, drought and native forests. In the inland Northwest here, our forests have always been considered moisture-limited forests. The tree species distribution and tree growth is really controlled by the available moisture. Periods of drought can permanently weaken individual trees. They actually, prolonged drought will collapse the transport cells in the trunk of a tree. Then they will never reinflate, even if you pour water on them. If they've gone through a couple of drought cycles and those cells collapse, it can lead to the death of the tree. As the next sentence says, prolonged drought can result in forest dieback, and drier forests obviously are more prone to wildfire. So if the native forests are what you're trying to manage for or around, what do you do when natives are no longer native? There's an area of research called phytomigration, and it is the movement of plant species through different geographies over time, and usually over millennia, in response to less than optimum growing conditions. So a researcher named Dennis Ferguson at the Rocky Mountain Research Station started to look at projections on what we could guess or estimate our native population, tree species, to be through the next century. So these charts will show a yellow, and that means there's a confidence of 50 to 75% that it will be good Doug fir habitat. A red says that there's 75 to 100% confidence. That's a good high confidence, and you can see from your knowledge of the West as well as this area that looks pretty correct. That in 2000, that's probably what we were looking at. Well, when we get to 2030. Suddenly we see a lot less red and a lot more yellow. The confidence that this is going to be good Doug fir habitat is starting to drop. And that's worrisome because this is where we are, right up here. And it's getting yellow. So when we look at 2090, there's very little confidence, or less than 50%, less than 75% confidence in a lot of areas that this is still going to be good Doug fir habitat. But Doug fir is one of the better species. When we look at lodgepole pine, and I'll pick up the speed here, and just because in the interest of time, but that's about what lodgepole pine distribution looked like in 2000. 2030, 10 years from now, we're down in that 50 to 75% confidence. And 2060, we're dropping the confidence down below 50%. 2090, there's less than a 50% confidence that there will be any lodgepole pine in this area. Let's look at western larch, an iconic species we all know and love. 2030, it's winking out. 2060, 2090, gone from this area. So, addressing wildfire risk. What are we going to do? We know that our tree species are changing. We know that our natives are being stressed. We know that we have drought. How are we going to manage these forests to increase wildfire resilience? Well, we do have some tools in our pocket. One is working with wildfire. But wildfire is really scary. I mean, and the conditions that we have now are pretty extreme. So, what causes wildfire? If you have low temperatures and high temperatures, a low relative humidity, you have wind, we're forming the oxygen side of the triangle, and fuels. Then we look at type, the moisture content, the size and shape, the quantity, the horizontal continuity, and the vertical arrangement. All that is, if that is all in its current conditions, which is pretty challenging. If you have an ignition source, and that can be human-caused or lightning, and those conditions are all present, you will get a fire. So the common themes between wildfire and drought, They share the same kinds of causes, and climate change is exacerbating those causes, and therefore risk reduction requires mitigating the causes. And the ways that we do that are protecting soil, because the soil acts as a sponge, and that's our reservoir of moisture. We enhance water retention, and meaning we disturb the surface of the soil less and make sure there's always a ground cover, a duff cover, and even leaving some slash and forest debris, because that has a lot of moisture retaining qualities to it, but we don't want to leave too much that would enhance a fire. And vegetation management. So that's what we're going to look at right now is vegetation management, because that's something we really can do something about. So again, what's our issue? Well, 100 plus years of fire suppression. That has allowed tree density to increase. In some cases, the tree density has increased 100% over what has been in the past. And also, that density tends to favor shade-tolerant trees. Shade-tolerant trees are those kinds of trees which do well and require shade to germinate. Not lodgepole pine, not ponderosa pine, but Doug fir, grand fir. They like to have shade when they germinate. So, and the pines like sunlight. So if you have a very dense forest, it's obviously going to favor those shade-tolerant trees like Doug fir. There's increased competition, and sadly increased competition. At the same time, there's less water and nutrients available per tree. So you have drought stress in your trees. You have increasing insect and disease, because stressed trees are more vulnerable to insect and disease. Therefore, you have a higher mortality, therefore increased fuel loading. So we're getting into this feedback loop that which allows trees and forests to become more susceptible to uncharacteristic fire behavior. And that's fire behavior that's hot and fast and really difficult to contain. So when we look at shade-tolerant trees, which are the least tolerant of fire, we see an interesting list. The least shade-tolerant to the most shade-tolerant, the larch ponderosa pine and lodgepole, which I've mentioned. Then we get into the white pine. Now we get in Doug fir, which is kind of in the middle range. But then all of these species that like the shade are also the least adapted to fire. It really is just an amazing lineup when you look at who's shade tolerant and who can withstand the fire the least. The lineup is almost identical. Doug fir, now it does, when it gets to a mature tree, it is much more adapted to fire and can be more fire resilient. But at that time, it's broken through the canopy and is the dominant tree. So, looking at the percentage of tree species in the Intermountain West, it's really quite shocking, because a ponderosa, the tree species before, we could expect them to be about 7% of the landscape, and now they're less than 3%. White pine, the same thing, has just really winked out. Western larch, again, very significantly less than there was in the past. However, Doug fir and grand fir, again, when we get into the shade-tolerant species, they are dominating on the landscape now versus the historical species distribution. And then throw in insects and disease. The bark beetles, which have really expanded not only their range, but the kinds of trees that they'll attack. This was taken from my home in Montana, and we had, in the lower elevations, we had mountain pine beetle attacking the pines, and then when we had the higher elevations here in Doug fir, the spruce budworm got into the Doug fir, and we've all seen the dwarf mistletoe, and so we're certainly dealing with those issues. And between 2000 and 2012, there were 46 million acres that were killed, acres of trees that were killed by bark beetles, and that's an area just slightly smaller than Colorado. So more dead trees on the landscape, more fuel on the landscape. A number of researchers, or many research papers, have concluded that fuel treatments in dry forest types can actually reduce fire severity and size, and these, if they're strategically placed, they can really also help protect property and natural resources. So That's what we're interested in figuring out. What kind of fuel treatments do we apply? How do we strategically place them? And how do we mimic nature? Well, when we used to have fires regularly coming through forests, this is pretty much, this right-hand side is pretty much what you saw, that you would have the fire would come through, clean up the forest slash, as well as reproduction of the shade-tolerant species like Doug fir. This looks like primarily a ponderosa pine stand. This is what it looked like before it was treated. And so what we want to do in our treatments are to reduce tree density and promote the fire-resistant tree species. So we'd come in here and take out any shade-tolerant species that were in there, reduce ladder fuels, and those are the fuels that come down close to the ground that a flame length of even a moderate height of 2 or 3 feet could ignite those, and they would travel up the dead branches of the tree into the tree crown, and then you get a canopy fire, which will move faster, hotter, and is more deadly to trees than keeping the fire on the ground. So limbing up so that you don't have that vertical continuity that I mentioned earlier in fuels. And but what that does is, besides just reducing fire risk, but it also increases forage and ground cover, so we get some protection of the soil, and then we have forage available for wildlife or for grazing. And when we remove these ladder fuels, a lot of them are very small and considered non-merchantable, but there are a lot of different uses that you can put those small diameter trees to. You can produce lumber. Vaughan specifically moved to equipment that can handle smaller diameter trees because they could see what was coming. You can do wood chips, firewood, biochar, fence posts, fence rails. There's really quite a long list, and I have a really interesting presentation about all the things that you can do with excess biomass and, of course, biochar. But let's talk about the role of good fire. As I mentioned in passing, and I know it's alarming to some people, but actually wildfire is really good for forest health. But small, frequent, low-intensity fires are the kinds of fires that we typically saw historically. As the fuels have increased, as the forest density has increased, as temperatures have gone up, as droughts have come, the fires burn a lot hotter and are much more challenging now. But this is an example of a good fire. A fire has come through. It burns in what we call a mosaic. So it's creating some openings, some new habitat, restarting the forest, and it's not very big. So easy to handle. Wildlife is not significantly displaced. The soils aren't damaged. So we're just, nature is providing a little cleanup and doing a reset on the forest. So if we can help reduce the intensity of wildfires through our vegetative treatments, we actually can get some of that good wildfire happening on the landscape. But another way to introduce fire a little more, with a little less risk, is using prescribed fire. And that's basically reintroducing fire into a fire-dependent ecosystem. So this is a before and after picture of a paradise burn, and this was on the Colville National Forest over in Pend Oreille County. And so the forest was thinned beforehand, but some of the smaller trees were left, and then fire was put onto the landscape, and it did exactly what it was supposed to do. Removed a lot of the debris on the forest floor and killed off a lot of these younger trees, reducing the density, but still allowing the reproduction, still allowing the undergrowth to return. And so it improves wildlife habitat, browse and forage, reduces the hazardous fuel loads, promotes regeneration and growth. But I will stress, do not try this at home. Do not do this without professional help, because we are working with nature, and sometimes nature has a different idea, like suddenly bringing in a very strong wind about midday after you've started a burn. Normally that doesn't happen because we watch the weather very carefully before any prescribed fire is put on the landscape. And obviously in conditions like we see now, you won't see prescribed fire again until maybe late in the fall if we have a really wet fall. But maybe next spring we'll have another window of opportunity to again use a natural tool to help improve the fire situation. And it's just a panorama of a prescribed fire, again, doing just what it needed to do. Oops. So, besides fire resilience on public lands, we also want to encourage all Forest Service neighbors, public land neighbors, to take a look at their own landscape and see if there's some things that you can do on your own land and around your home that will reduce property loss and damage from wildfire. And so for private homeowners, there's some really great programs out there. Firewise is one of them. It's a very broad partnership. It includes federal partners as well as state. And it's looking at the area right around your house and helping you understand the kinds of things that would encourage wildfire and potential property damage. It encourages neighbors to work together, and it has a recognition program with it. And we have a Northeast Region contact in Guy Gifford. He works for the Spokane Conservation District. This is his phone number. And we'll put these slides back up. We're also recording this, and so these will be available for you to come back and see and use. There's a national program called Ready, Set, Go, and it's actually an international association of fire chiefs that developed the program to help fire departments educate rural residents in high-risk wildfire areas, stressing wildfire preparedness. And it also works in concert with Firewise and fire-adapted communities. And there's a personal action guide that you can get at this website. I had a little difficulty getting that because I need to sign in, create an account, and download it, and I don't know that there's more information there than you would find at the Firewise program or at the wildfireready.com, which addresses fire-adapted communities. And that's taking the Firewise programming and broadening it to neighborhoods and communities and getting people to work together to help make their entire neighborhood more resilient in the face of wildfire. And so they provide guidelines and consultation as well as a recognition program. Now, if you have some forest land, there are also some really great programs to help small private forest land owners. And one is a Forest Resilient Cost Share that's at the federal level. That's with the Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS. And they have consultation and an application process focused on vegetation treatments, cost sharing on greater than 10 acres, and it's called the Joint Chiefs Landscape Restoration Partnership. And I can attest that it is a really good program because I have personally used it. You will need to develop a stewardship plan that looks at your forest and looks at conditions, and it's a deep dive into how you can best manage your land for the objectives that you have, not necessarily for maximizing timber production, but depending on your personal objectives, whether it's aesthetics or wildlife or a combination. There are interesting prescriptions and treatments that you can use, and then you essentially sign a contract with NRCS, a 3-year contract, and you get you do the commercial thinning, which they do not help with, but all the small diameter thinning, the limbing, the brush cleanup, they will help you cover those costs. Likewise, there's a forest resilience cost share program with the state, DNR, and they likewise do consultation and help with the application, and you do a stewardship plan, and they focus on vegetation treatments on and land ownership of 10 acres or less. And there's a great website on our web pages on DNR that talk about the cost share for this Forest Health Assistance for Small Forest Landowners is the name of their program. And if you just want some information, WSU Extension has a fabulous list of links and resources and these, they even go in, they even have these, the resources or the information divided into, are you interested in stream restoration or wildlife restoration or reintroducing beavers? I mean, whatever area of interest you have, there's there's some resources that will address it at their on the WSU Extension site. So that's a really good one to go to if you just want to learn more. So there's options for private, there's options for state, there's options for federal public lands, and if we all work together, we can create broad landscapes that are more resilient to wildfires. So thank you. And to find out more about NUFIC or ask any questions that don't get answered tonight, here's our contact information. And again, I hope Dick was able to join us. And also, this is our website for NUFIC, which is really interesting. We also have a Facebook page and are on Instagram. So with that, I will open it up to questions.
Thank you, Gloria. Anyone have any questions out there? I will start with just one. I saw an article in the Spokesman Review today about how prescribed fire is great for the landscape, but it's been a little bit slow to catch on and gain acceptance. I was wondering if you think it is gaining acceptance and kind of your comments on that.
Sure. Yes, it is. It is gaining acceptance because, as we saw on those charts, that the size and intensity of wildfires is really, really increasing, and that gets your attention. And so the public is, and very, very rightfully so, there's been concerns about prescribed fire because, one, you can't always control it. We collectively, those who are interested in promoting forest vegetation management for wildfire resilience, really want to see the prescribed fire on the landscape, but we recognize that we can run into situations where it escapes or it puts a lot of smoke in the air. And for those of us who have asthma or other health conditions, we don't want to be inundated with smoke when it was caused by a human, So, but we have learned a lot in the prescribed fire community about how, where, when to set these prescribed fires and to recognize how to do it in a way that is not going to smoke out the local community. And so with greater acceptance of, okay, we're going to have, maybe an afternoon of smoke, but it should clear out in the morning, people are becoming more accepting of it and recognizing that, again, fire is part of forest health and part of a natural cycle of regeneration and fire. So it is becoming more acceptable.
Thank you. We got a couple of questions in the chat. First was from Mike Peterson. He's a fellow board member. He asked, can you tell us how Indigenous peoples dealt with fire?
Great question, Mike. Thank you. Yes, Indigenous people used fire extensively. There's been some really great research has been done in the past 20 years looking at how Native peoples managed their landscapes. And they truly did manage their landscapes. And they would use fire regularly, whether it was grass fires, prairie fires, or in the forest. Frequently, what tribes would do would be to spend the summer in the high country, because it's cooler and there are more resources for food, etc. And then when they returned to the lowlands in the fall, they would just set fires behind them and send a fire up the mountainside, because they knew when they came back in a few years that the habitat would be better for wildlife. Wildlife would be attracted to that area, so more food sources for them, that it would regenerate and renew berry crops, and other important fuels and vegetation for their needs. So they worked very closely with nature. It was a little easier then because catastrophic wildfires were far less frequent, and because they were welcoming to these small fast fires, and it also kept the forest clean, easy for them to travel again and grow more vegetation, more foods. So indigenous people used fire extensively to help them survive and thrive in their landscape, and it worked well on the landscape as well.
Thank you. We have a question from Ed Callahan. He asked, if a private landowner is interested in prescribed fire, are there protections from liability if the fire escapes and threatens adjacent lands?
Ed, that's a very good question. I am not aware of liability protections if the fire escapes and goes on to adjacent private lands. There may be some kinds of professionals that you can hire who would absorb that liability. It is, if you have a fairly small landscape and a lot of neighbors, I'm not sure you could find somebody who would be excited about doing that for you, particularly if there were continuous fuels from your property to the next. However, if you were in a situation where you had fairly distinct boundaries, say an edge of a forest that drops down to grassland as on your forest border, or you have a road or a creek or some barriers that create a holding line, you may be able to find consultants who will work with you to do that. And it may be that you can work with your neighbors and collectively agree that, okay, we're going to try a prescribed burn on 3 properties, which is actually, even though it's bigger, it's easier, because with 3 properties, you're probably dealing with enough acreage that you can find those natural barriers and those fire breaks that will allow better control of the prescribed fire. But I'm sorry, I don't know the precise answer to that, but that's my opinion. Is there anybody else on the line who has more information about that? And I see that someone has asked for the PDF. We're going to put this recording on our website, but I'm thinking that maybe we should pull out those private the landowner contact and sources for assistance and make that more visible than being buried in a recording or deep in a PDF, because those are really good resources. And I double-checked the links, and they all work and take you where you're supposed to go. They change pretty frequently, so I always check before I make them public.
Yeah, I was going to send a thank you email to the attendees, so I think I can just send the PDF out with that too.
Oh, good. That would be great.
I was also going to ask, do you have just a couple, we have just a few more minutes. I was going to ask one other question. Do you have any examples of just a couple of things that, private landowners can do to help, prevent spread of wildfire?
Yes, if I'm understanding your question correctly, on our property here, we're south of Colville in the Huckleberry Range, near the ridge, but on the east side, and we have 65 acres, and we treated 50 acres under the NRCS cost share program. Our neighbor to the west has 160 acres, and he treated 90 some, and a neighbor to the east treated another 15 acres that was a border of forest between our forest and their open pastures. So we actually got 3 neighbors together to take advantage of these programs and create a larger landscape that is more fire resilient. So you can, try to get your neighbors involved with that. So, I'm sitting in the middle of an example of that. And if you contact the agencies, a number of us have volunteered that we would, welcome people to come and tour, the work that's been done, see how we did it, see the results. People do have fears about cutting trees. If you live in a forest, you move there on purpose. You like the forest, the aesthetics of the forest, the wildlife, all the other benefits that you accrue from living in a forest. I love it myself. It was a hard decision to cut trees, but I knew it needed to be done because I know what I just showed you in this slideshow. So, but around near the house and our primary use area, we did a spacing of about 15 feet, and it's really, we took out a lot of trees, but you wouldn't notice it. It's like, wow, this isn't really very thin. Even though we took out a lot, it underscored really how dense it was. We moved to a 20 to 25 foot spacing in an area that was further away from the house. And that still looks great. So, and we even tried some skips and gaps and did a 30-acre spacing. Now that looks a lot more open, or 30 feet spacing. I'm sorry. That looks more open, but the combination and diversity is really quite attractive. And the wildlife didn't miss a beat. In that zone, there's just deer and moose, and a few elk now and then. And wolves and mountain lions and bears. It's pretty nice. But so, and I believe that Vaughan Brothers did a film. I'll check in with them and see if we can put a link to that on our website. I know that they filmed the kind of before and after and some of the work that we were doing here as part of a public education and outreach combo. I know that demonstration units or prescriptions are going to be done over in the Indian Creek Community Forest, south of the Kalispel Reservation. The Kalispel tribe is very interested in helping demonstrate what good treatment looks like, fire-resilient treatments. So that's available. And then, obviously, the Forest Service has done a lot of treatments, and we can point to some of those from the projects that we at NUFIC have worked on, as well as the Forest Service can identify those areas as well, so people can see what it actually looks like.
Very nice, thank you. We got a couple other questions here. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, I see a question from Tim in the chat about pro-forestation.
Yes. Have you heard about it, and can you explain how it can help with reducing wildfire risk as well as improving wildfire habitat?
Well, Tim, I think that you are probably the most knowledgeable on that. So do you know? Can you enlighten us? Because I have not heard of pro-forestation. Tim, are you still with us? Well, we'll see if Tim circles back, and there's something to research, but I see a note from Craig Madsen wondering the role that wildlife grazing can play in long-term fuels and forest management. Thank you for that question, because we're actually going to demonstrate that here at our place. My husband and I are stewards here at Terra Flora Permaculture Learning Center. We're actually the owners, but we like to say stewards. And we are going to demonstrate that ourselves because we have been controlling forest undergrowth with a combination of sheep and goat grazing. And until a couple of months ago, we had an ox, and he was a beautiful boy. He passed away from old age and broke my heart, but he could reach up. He was 6'4" at the shoulder, so he could reach up about 10 feet, which is lovely. And so he would browse on limbs and the tops of bushes, and the sheep and goats would get the low stuff. And so have been really able, in those areas that we have fenced, have really been able to control the regrowth. And that's one of the things that everyone needs to recognize, that when you put a treatment, and when you do a forest treatment, it's not a one and done, because after about 6-8 years, you start getting all that regrowth back. So you need to have a plan on how you're going to control the understory when it comes back in abundance. It will, in places, come back in abundance. Other places that are hot and dry, you may not have as much filling in. It may just be grass and forbs. But livestock grazing is really important component. One of the things that my husband and I are investigating is fencing the 35 acres that has been treated, and doing a rotational grazing pattern through there, specifically to keep the undergrowth down. So yes, livestock grazing can be really important, as long as it's not overdone. I say rotational grazing because our animals will want to go to the lushest, easiest, most convenient places, and you want to make sure they move around and don't hit any place too hard, because if they do, they'll expose more soil, and that's counterproductive to the whole concept of retaining soil moisture. And so you want to move them around so that they don't over-impact a certain area. But so that's the livestock. And Tim, it looks like Tim might have left the stage, but he said proforestation is growing trees to their age. And what that means is that allowing trees to live to their natural lifespan, which is basically protecting older, large trees and old growth. And old growth, I hesitate to use the term old growth because old growth also implies certain habitat conditions and certain sizes, because a few older trees scattered across the landscape don't technically constitute old growth. They are old trees, but old growth also implies a whole ecosystem. I could go on and on, but I will pause again and see if there are any more questions. And I'm willing to stay on longer if someone has a question we can't answer in a few minutes here. So, but again, I don't want to bore everybody with just going on and on. So, any more questions?
Well, if there's no other questions, I just wanted to say thank you everyone for attending. We really appreciate you taking time out of your day. And if you provided your address when you registered, then we will be sending some swag out. Probably will be coasters, stickers, and a stainless steel pint cup. So we also had a question. Ed was asking about the permaculture organization that you run.
Yeah, it's not necessarily an organization, it's because it's just us, but we are demonstrating a lot of different agroforestry practices, silvopasture, guilds, edible food forests, polyculture gardens, and polyculture gardens are gardens that include perennials, annuals, domestics, and natives. And so we have trees intermixed with what is a vegetable garden too. But we also are growing, we have over 125 edible medicinal plants, native and domestic. And so we offer tours free, if people want to come out and see what's possible to grow. We've added about 600 edible trees, shrubs, and vines to our landscape. And some of them are highly unusual. So we're up at about 2,800 feet. So what we're just trying to do is show people how you can live in a forest, support the forest, allow the forest to provide all of its ecosystem services, and yet really have a highly productive landscape that is highly diverse, so that you're covered regardless of if you have a hot summer or cold summer or wet spring, dry spring, whatever. We always have something that does very well in those conditions and produces a lot of food. So nutrient-dense food, which is really important too. So, and we integrate livestock and poultry into the whole system so that we have our little helper friends out there doing what they do best.
Sounds really amazing. I want to tour one of these days.
Well, that's great. I was thinking I should have a NUFIC meeting out here one of these days and allow people to see why, when you ask about what exciting things have you done, I'm always talking about some farm thing, So.
Yeah, the updates. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to stop recording now. Thank you so much for everyone for attending. And we hope that you'll join us next week for talking on public lands. All right.
Great. Thanks, everybody.